Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another Student Worship to Go. We are so glad that you've been joining with us over the past couple of weeks, and this week as we continue on our study of Ecclesiastes and trying to find meaning. And guys, we're just so glad that we were able to be back, and we're able to got to see many of you in worship this past Sunday, and man, what a blessing. I'm so thankful to be back together and worshiping and to see your faces on Sunday mornings. But also, if you've been coming to our Sunday and Wednesday night meetings, we're so glad that you're there and you're hanging out with us. And come join us as we begin to walk through some of the parables of Jesus, and we study that. And so, if you're a high schooler, we'd love to see you on Sunday nights at 6, and then if you're in junior high, on Wednesday nights at 6. And be paying attention for where those are going to be, the different locations and stuff as we'll post in, and we'll make sure it gets on the email and all the kind of different things. But we're so glad you're joining with us tonight, and please worship with us.
Stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard the tender whisper of love in the dead of night, and you tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good father. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am, it's who I am, it's who I am. Oh, and I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good father. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am, it's who I am, it's who I am. 'Cause you are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. To us, you are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. To us, and it's love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still in the love. Love, you're a good, good father. It's who you are, it's who you are, it's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am, it's who I am, it's who I am.
Well, once again, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Student Worship to Go. And welcome back as we continue on our study of Ecclesiastes and finding meaning. And as we just search that out and what does it all mean, and we kind of arrived at this just again through the craziness of this world, right? And what the past few months have been like and everything that we've been through, and it can just all seem so crazy and so pointless, and you just leave us asking, God, what is the purpose of this life? And so we've been studying Ecclesiastes, where Solomon has that very same problem, where he finds it and gets it all, and then he begins to question, well, what is the meaning of life, and what does this all mean? And so we're getting to kind of sit down and kind of have a mentoring kind of lesson with one of the wisest men that have ever lived on the face of this earth, in King Solomon. And so week one, we talked about how kind of Solomon noted the cyclical world, and how he kind of stuck to that theme of all is vanity. And he kind of noted that the world was vanity because it just does the same thing over and over again, whether it's, scientifically speaking, and that, like the natural cycles of the world, and just there's days, and then the water cycles, and then just everything, and it all just comes back around. He talked about, historically speaking, how humans are creatures of habit, and we tend to do the same things over and over and over. And then even philosophically speaking is how he's kind of like, there is not much new thought that happens in the world, and we just kind of are rediscovering kind of the same things as they come and go. And so the conclusion that Solomon kind of came through that was that the world is fleeting, and again, it's because of that word, the Hebel, the vanity. I mean, it's all meaningless. It's like a breath or a vapor, and then he uses the phrase under the sun. So it's all vanity under the sun. And so what Solomon is telling, that everything under the sun, which is pretty much everything on earth, right, is meaningless. And it's fleeting, and it's here today, gone tomorrow. And then also the world forgets quickly, and then we just move on. And whether you did something noteworthy or not, the world will eventually forget and move on. And then so it's best to not build up, or depend on your legacy here. And then finally, the world doesn't satisfy, and we talked about how even somebody like Tom Brady, who at the pinnacle of his career, goes on an interview and says, what is it, like there's got to be something else out there. And Solomon was sitting there doing the same thing. He had reached the pinnacle. He had it all as a king, and he was still unsatisfied. But ultimately, we came to the conclusion that even though the world, is fleeting and forgets and doesn't satisfy, that our meaning is found outside this world, not in it. And we have a God that is not under the sun, but who created it and who chose to enter the mess of this chaos world to redeem it. And then last week we talked specifically about how the world doesn't satisfy. And we kind of dove into that, and that the world doesn't satisfy. And we talked about how happiness does not equal satisfaction. And Solomon kind of addresses the life that he lived, and how it was so extravagant, and he did whatever he wanted and got whatever his heart desired, but yet he was never, ever satisfied. And then he talked about how wisdom did not mean understanding, because they were like, even he being a wise man did not understand all things. And we too can try to seek out wisdom. That does not guarantee that we will understand. And then we talked about our jobs, not being our purpose. And someone kind of talks about, like how he tried to be a great leader, and how he tried to be, successful and lead to all these things, and it was not the purpose of his life. We talked about how the true purpose of our life is a calling from God. And we talked about how despair is not an answer. We can't just give up. That is not a correct answer either. And how we must continue in our calling for God and just pursue Him greatly. And we return finally to that same phrase, meaning is found outside this world, not in. And we arrive at the conclusion, God is our purpose. He created us for Himself, to serve Himself, and just be all about Him. God is our purpose. And so today we continue on. And so Solomon has made these deep arguments about the world being pointless and vain, but Solomon, being wise, he's kind of like a philosopher, and being the wisest man himself, he is just about the only one capable of arguing against himself, which is crazy to think. Like he's in this, and so he begins kind of this chess match against himself, and so he argues kind of against his own points here. And so we kind of really dive back in, and he starts addressing some of the things that he talks about. And so if you remember, again, we talked about how in chapter 1 kind of talks about the cyclical world and how that's all pointless and vain. And so now kind of Solomon comes back and readdresses that issue here today in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes. But I'm going to read it for us. We're going to read the first 15 verses, the first 15 verses of chapter 3. And so read with me here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and time for peace. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which already has been, that which is to be, already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. God, I thank you for this time, God, and I thank you for just the ability to come and kind of dig into your word, God, as we get to sit down and kind of have this conversation with Solomon here, God. And so I pray that as we kind of dig into this, God, that it would be your words and not mine. And God, we would try to find some meaning in this crazy world, God, through this passage right here. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So guys, again, this is Solomon kind of arguing his own point. Arguing, that he starts off talking about how the world is extremely cyclical, and to go back to chapter 1, he talks about a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north, and around it goes the wind. And on its circuits, the wind returns. Oh, dang it. Ugh.
I can cut that out.
Okay. Man, I was trying to fight it too. All right, so I'm going to go back. And so again, guys, we talked about how in chapter 1, Solomon kind of talks about how the whole world is cyclical. And with that, he kind of is going back here and refuting his own argument, or not necessarily refuting, but arguing with himself as we see him kind of come to these realizations about the world around him. And as the wisest man, he ponders these questions over long periods of time. And so we see here, in response to what he says in chapter 1, which was kind of about, how a generation comes and a generation goes. The sun rises and the sun goes down, and it hastens back to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north, and around goes the wind on its circuits and returns. And he ends up saying it's all vanity, because it's all been done over and over and over again, and it's just one big circle. But see again the contrast here to the kind of poem that he writes in chapter 3, and how there's a time for everything. And so what he kind of notes here is it is God that is in control of the world. It is God that controls the world. And that because there is a time for everything, God has purposed all things to be in order. And to kind of break down this poem a little bit, there's a time to be born and a time to die. That's kind of common sense. Every person is born at some point, and there's only been one man on this earth that's never not died, and that's Jesus. But even then, he technically died. He rose again from the grave and defeated death. So there is always a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, right? Farmers know there's a proper time in which to, plant your crops. That's springtime, right? That's where the majority of crops get planted. Springtime is the typical time, like you plant. But there's also a time to harvest those plants. Or even more so, just to pluck up what is planted, it could be there's a time to weed. There's a time to pull up what shouldn't be growing, or to pull up a plant that is not doing well and replace it with a plant that will. And so there's a time to pluck up and a time to plant. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. This could be talking about war, but it could also be talking about maybe even sickness. There's a time for death and there's time for healing. And in God's way, He is working that out. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's times to be sad. There's times to be happy. There's time to break down and a time to build. Old things need to be broken down sometimes so that new things can be built. Right? There's a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. The promised land was known for being very rocky. And matter of fact, I've heard that there's a phrase that sometimes tour guides will use to describe the Palestine area. And they said, when God was creating the earth, He handed all these stones to an angel and said to disperse them throughout the world. And the saying goes that he tripped when he got to Palestine and spilled them. And so the ground there is particularly very, very rocky. And so even just to be able to plant a field, a farmer would have to go through and get rid of all the stones in his field. And so there's a time to cast away stones. But stones were not entirely useless. Stones in themselves are not either good nor bad because they have a good purpose as well. How many times throughout the Bible did God say to go and gather some stones and make an altar? But also in the in these days, they would use stones as part of wall making. And so there's a time to cast away the stones and there's a time to go gather them up because you need them for a specific purpose. There's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, right? You might as well say there's a time to say hello and a time to say goodbye. There's a time to tear and a time to sow. That's referring to clothes. There's a time to, in this time period when you would mourn or you would grieve, you would tear your clothes. So there's a time to tear your clothes and there's a time to stitch them back together, right? And to move on. There's a time to seek and a time to lose. And there's a time to keep and a time to cast away. There were times to go out and find what is lost, right? Maybe a lost sheep or a lost coin. Maybe you go out and seek those, right? Those were both parables that Jesus would use. But there was also a time in which you would say something is lost and you need to let it go. There are times when things need to be cleaned out, right, and gotten rid of. There's a time, where God would call to get rid of all the idols, clean them out, bury them, burn them, get rid of them, do something with them. I just don't want them here no more. And so there's a time to keep and a time to lose. There is a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Almost kind of self-explanatory too, right? There's a time to talk and a time to listen. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. That last one can sound a little bit crazy there, right? A time to love and a time to hate. Because you could be saying, when are Christians ever called to hate? Why would he say that? Why is there a time to hate? We're always taught love, love, love. But the reality is we are told to hate something, right? We're told to hate sin. And so there's a time to love and a time to hate. You know, a time to love people but hate sin. So everything in this world, right, from this, Solomon goes back and says here, hey, there's a time for everything. And even though it's cyclical, right, we just go around and around and around and around, there's a purpose to that. Again, arguing with himself. And God has a plan and purpose for all those things, good and bad. And we humans, right, we're patterned creatures. We appreciate the rhythm. And matter of fact, it's not even lost here that it's kind of ironic that he's talking about patterns and rhythms, and he puts that into a poem that has a very kind of specific rhythm that you kind of get caught up in while reading it. And so there is a point and a purpose to everything in this world. And we acknowledge that this is one of the most well-known pieces of scripture in this Bible, this poem, because it's oftentimes most read at funerals when we are trying to explain why someone has died. You know, and there's a time and a purpose for that, and God has positioned it that way. So it is God that controls the world. God that controls the world. But I want you to see here too what Solomon kind of says. And he kind of says two things about not being in control. Two things about not being in control. And he kind of starts off by saying here, hey, no control is a burden. No control is a burden on humanity. But then he also says, no control is a gift. And so as we dive into here, we dive into this debate among himself, or between himself here and the wisest man, we're going to look at both those sides, how not having control of our own life can be a burden, but also how that is a gift from God. And so here, let's dive into it. And we're going to really look again here starting in verse 9. We'll reread here. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Yet he has made everything beautiful in its time. But also he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. And so we see a little bit of a paradox there. And again, this is like an argument between Solomon and himself. You know, he said, what gain do we have from all this toil? Like, what gain if I work and I work and I work and I work? What is the point of that? I have seen the business, that God has given to his children to be busy with. And he's right, God has given this to humanity to busy themselves with. And he's like, well, yeah, but God has made beautiful everything in its time. But yet also God has given us eternity. And so what is he saying here? What is he really saying? What he's saying is that we cannot understand how all the parts and pieces of this world fit together. Our knowledge and perspective as humankind, are severely limited. We do not have the proper capability to understand everything that God knows, because we are not infinite beings. Just even thinking about that concept of eternity can be mind-boggling to us because we have no sense of eternity. We have no idea what it means to exist outside of time. A movie that came out a few years ago and had Matthew McConaughey in it. It's called Interstellar, and it's about kind of space and them traveling through to different planets, and it's kind of how they talk about how gravity affects time and all these kind of things, and eventually at one point in the movie, not to kind of spoil it, but one character kind of goes outside of time and manipulates things that are in the past. And he's able to view time as kind of like this, just like outside of it, and view it and say, okay, here is this event, here is this event, here is this event, here is this event. And so that's kind of like what I've always kind of assumed would be the best look at what it would be like to kind of view something as kind of maybe the way that God does in his eternal time. He sees time not as we do, but he sits outside of it. And so to think that we can't even very well comprehend that, Solomon's kind of saying we can't. We can't comprehend these things. We can't always see the point and the purpose because we are not God and we are not sitting outside of time and seeing how all this works together. And so we have been gifted by God this work to do. And he makes all things beautiful. But yet also, we have been given eternity in our hearts, as he says. And because of that, we seek meaning and purpose. It's because of that we have this void. And the eternity in our hearts, it gives us gives us this need and this drive to figure out what are the purpose of our existence. Because our souls are eternal beings. Our souls are eternal things that are trapped here in mortality. And so we kind of seek to figure out what is the point of this. And the reason that we do that is because God has prepared us for eternity. And he prepared us for eternity with him, right? His ultimate, goal, I would think, would be that every single person on the planet would have come to know him and be with him. And unfortunately, not everybody will make it, right? But our souls are still eternal either way. And so we will either spend eternity in hell or eternity with God. And it won't be until we get to those points that we truly understand. And so we have been prepared for eternity, but not yet given all the answers. And that's why we seek these things so desperately. But, like I said, God has given us this gift at the same time. And so to not be in control is a gift. And that's my second point, right? To know control is a gift. Because, see, no control gives us the opportunity to trust God. And another word for that is to have faith, right? Have faith. It gives us the opportunity to trust God. Because we've already established God is in control. Solomon establishes that, right? There's a time for everything. And God has placed that time. There's a time for everything in life. And so, with God being in control, we also have been given characteristics about God, right? We know that God is compassionate, and he's abounding in love, and he's gracious and merciful and kind, slow to anger, eager to forgive. And because of those characteristics, we know that God has our best interests at heart. We know that he wants us to be successful. And so, we can trust him. We can believe in him. And so, we can find satisfaction in him. And I think, like I said earlier, we humans are constantly seeking what's the point? What's the meaning, right? That's the whole thing of this. What is the meaning? We need to be part of a grand story, right, in order to kind of find satisfaction. We want our lives to mean something. So whether that's in the grand scheme of things or short term, we want to find meaning. And so by trusting God and trusting in his plan, we have been gifted a piece of God's grand story to be a part of. And that is where we find our satisfaction. And no control, having no control over our lives, we find the key to our satisfaction as humans. That we can step back and just let God do it. And that's what Solomon is kind of saying here. Listen, and starting in verse 12, I perceive that there is nothing for them better than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat, drink, and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. And I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, and that which is to be already has been. And God seeks what has been driven away. And don't misunderstand, Solomon is not saying here, okay, you know what, God, you got this, I'm going to do nothing. All right, you got it, I'm just going to kind of float through life, just wherever I happen to be, yep, that's probably where God wanted me to be. No, that's not what he's saying. We are not called to be passive people, as Christians. But instead, Solomon is kind of jarring us back to a proper view, a proper perspective of life, and how we ought to balance a trust with God with the work that we ought to do here on earth. Kind of that James kind of paradox that even Martin Luther struggled with. If we are really saved, you can tell we are saved by what we are doing. If we're really trusting in God, you can tell if we're really trusting in God by the actions that we are taking and we are doing. And it's constantly, though, in combat. And why we don't always trust God is our sin nature. And our sin nature is constantly trying to drive us to fill voids in our soul and with our work, or or the meaningless pursuits that Solomon talks about, how he sought out all of his heart's desires, and those will never fill us up, right? But what brings satisfaction is finding a deep, personal, trusting relationship with God himself. I heard it said once, somebody was asking Albert Einstein's second wife, they said to her, Miss Einstein, do you understand Professor Einstein's theory of relativity? Because that's what Albert Einstein is famous for, the equals MC squared, And she said, no, I don't understand the theory of relativity, but I understand Professor Einstein. And that's all I need. She didn't care about all of his science. She didn't care about, what he was doing and all that. She just cared about him. I think that's what we need to do with God. God is God, right? He sits above and he owes us no explanation for anything. He is in control of all things and does all things. But what he has done is come down and give us himself. He has given us his Son to walk the earth with us, to explain things to us, to die for us. And he has given his Spirit to do daily life with us, to help with understanding, to give us comfort and peace and walk with us. He has given us himself. And he said, no matter what comes against you, no matter the craziness of life, no matter what it may be, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. Why do we need to understand all these complexities of life when we have the man that created life? Why do we need to understand what the purpose is when we have the very God that has determined the purpose of everything that has ever existed? And if we have him in our corner, we can simply say, what is it that this world can do to me? What is it that this world can take from me? It does not matter, for I have God. And so that's what I want to kind of leave us with, today, is that no matter what, God is in control. No matter when it seems pointless, no matter when it seems there is no meaning, no matter whatever is happening, God is in control, and we can trust Him. And we can be thankful that we aren't in control, right? Because I believe if I was in control of this world, it probably would be more screwed up than it already was. And that's saying something, isn't it? But our God loves us, and He is in control, and He is in our corner. And so therefore we do not fear the world. God, I thank you for this awesome just word that you've given us, and I thank you for giving us yourself. And that no matter what this world has to offer, no matter how much we may seek to understand things and be frustrated, God, it doesn't matter because you are in control and we have access to you. What else do we need, God? And so I pray that as we go throughout this next week, God, that we would remember that, God, that you are in control, and it doesn't matter what comes against us this next week, all the struggles, all the craziness of this world, it does not matter, God, you are in control. We don't have to worry about it. Your plan is in motion. And I pray, God, that we would seek to find and be a part of that plan. And I pray all that in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week, guys.